University of North Texas in Dallas. He studied at Ravenshaw College, Utkal University, Tulane University, and Texas A&M University, and has worked at Regional College of Education, BZB College, Newcomb College, Loyola University, Tulane University, Louisiana State University in Shreveport, and Central Washington University. I mean, he has the opportunity and the privilege to serve so many institutions. So it's indeed a matter of great privilege that he is with us today. Professor Sura has also served as co-editor. In fact, he's serving, co-editor of the Journal of Contemporary Thought and as editorial board member for the Flannery O'Connor Review. He has served as a Fulbright visiting professor in India and in Stockholm University. Professor Rath today shall be enlightening us on the topic, which is very interesting and as well as intriguing. The title is Absence Essence, a Poetics of Absence. With this, I straight away, without wasting much of time, invite Professor Rath to enlighten and deliver his talk to the audience. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Singh. This is, well, I don't know whether I should say good morning or good evening because it's 10:30 at night here in Dallas. It's usually, my usual time is it's about 1 hour after my sleep. So, but I'm not going to fall asleep here. I have, as Professor Singh mentioned in his gracious introduction, I left India in 1975, and after finishing my PhD, I began working at LSU in Shreveport and moved on to Central Washington University as a dean of the Honors College. And I have been here at UNT Dallas for the last 10 years. So altogether, I have been here for about 45, 48 years now. As a scholar, as a student and scholar of English and American literature, my orientation is mostly in new criticism. I am a new critical scholar, basically. And I had the good fortune of being a student, direct student of Professor Cleant Brooks, who wrote Understanding Fiction and Understanding Poetry with Robert Penn Warren. The book came out, of course, in 1938, and I had the privilege of studying with him for a semester and spending some time with him, both at his house and in his library, etc. And I have also studied with, actually not studied with, but worked with other new critical scholars, very well known in the United States, people like Donald Stanford, for example, and Dick Adams, who was department chair at Tulane when I was a student there. And but then I also had people like not quite my teachers, but people whom I listened to at different seminars and workshops. And these are people who are in deconstruction, including Derrida and Gayatri Spivak. So my own thinking toward teaching and toward writing, both as a scholar and as a student, and as a teacher, it's a mix of both. And the paper that I'm going to present to you today is called Absence to Essence, a Poetics of Absence. And it had its origin many years ago, several years ago, probably about 15 years ago, when I was visiting a friend, driving on highway and visiting a friend in the state of Alabama, when I saw something I saw a statue. So that's where I will start. Towering atop a hill on the northern city limits of Birmingham, Alabama, stands a tall statue of Hephaestus, the blacksmith of gods. Myth has it that when Jews prepared to populate the earth, he asked Hephaestus to build the human frame with a window in its chest. So he would fill it with flesh, blood, and bones, and anyone who wanted could see from outside what was inside the living person. In his haste to assemble the parts, the blacksmith forgot to force the window on the frame, and the new creation became an object of mystery and speculation as to the nature of its core material, the meaning or the essence of man. This, in essence, is the field of poetics, identifying the component parts of a text, both visible and hidden, and reconstructing the process of their merging together to create something new. Scholars who trace the origin of the universe to a vast nothingness and justify thereby the mysterious presence of a master maker explain the ex nihilo beginning of everything in the world as an incongruous vacancy underlying the very essence of creation. While theologically, the paradox of such a genesis has held ground for centuries, philosophically, the miraculous transformation of nothing into something baffles our common sense. How did something come out of nothing? In literature, especially in poetry, the poet's act of creation serves as an analogy for God's mysterious creation. In analyzing the production of the new thing, which is poetry, we are called upon to seek a logic behind this divine conundrum, the paradox of essence born out of absence. Essence, according to Plato's theory of forms, is that invisible, ineffable, imperceptible, but original something underlying everything, which suggests that the prior absence manifests itself in a post-existence presence, a fluid, flexible center for a circle that shifts its form constantly. In other words, it is no longer what it seems to be, nor what it could be, but something new and different. Or we have no poetics if we have no poetry. However, if we conceptualize that nothingness as a tangible imaginary, as a silent or silenced existence in limbo, where everything is fluid and formless, then the earlier absence reappears, albeit at the risk of downplaying the magic of the maker. At its radical extreme, this requires a poetics of absence at the point of zero reference, a Heideggerian Dasein, where reality is an endless game of being with a capital B and beings, small b. Here I take two poems, William Wordsworth's A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal and Wallace Stevens' The Snowman, to venture such a poetics of absence through a deconstructive reading of the emptiness that lies at their core. Recent scholarship has focused on two aspects of such a poetics of silence and a poetics of absence. In Science and Sanity, for example, in 1941, the semanticist Alfred Korzybski refers to a writer's dwelling silently at the object level and maintaining a physical and neurological delay before proceeding to the descriptive level or the verbal level of abstraction. The things we can see only when we slow down and practice silence, he says. The sensory level gives us a world of motion, solidity, and intensity. It is real and it is not words. It is apprehended only in silence. This is all Korzybski, by the way. Forcing language at the non-verbal, sensory, or perceptual level could be detrimental to forming a holistic view of things. Korzybski holds that silence denigrates noise or wild talk, but communicates differently and more effectively. Language or verbal articulation has limitations. It cannot express the whole thought or idea. There are things unsayable or unexpressible in words. Silence takes over when words fail. We find that in many poets, for example, T.S. Eliot talks a lot about it. Silence, in the heart of life, the silence. Wittgenstein, in his Tractatus, rightly says, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. When we encounter the limits of the sayable, we acknowledge the existence of unsayable things, and by means of a language somehow formed on being silent, articulate that which cannot be grasped. Natural replication in language defies verbalization. It forms the unwritten and unwritable, unsaid and unsayable base of the utterance. Silence doesn't mean total passivity. Rather, it encourages deep thoughts, pondering, reflection, introspection, and meditation. It augments appreciation, pleasure, and joy at the perceptual level. Silence has philosophical, religious, and poetic connotations. Great thinkers, philosophical artists, and poets create immortal works by silent practice. Silence is creative and life-sustaining. Our mind is filled with noise, and the radio station NST is playing persistently. NST stands for non-stop thinking. Practicing silence is perhaps a basic condition to hear the call of beauty, or of love, or of life. The pageant of visual images in Keats's Grecian urn, or the melody of the Abyssinian maid sung in Coleridge's Kubla Khan, or a beautiful sunrise can all be comprehended in silence. There are different ways and modes of silence too. It could also be construed as the power of the quiet in a world of noise. The Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain meditative practices, for example, emphasize attention and mindfulness and practicing silence as a means to grasp the reality of truth and to see into the life of things. That's a phrase that Wordsworth uses in many of his poems. Silence, or absence of speech, words, and sound, is a human act and can be a means of protest also. It has socio-political and ethical implications in Mahatma Gandhi's silent satyagraha, or fasting, which is the absence of food, and convey dissent. How urgent is it to cultivate practicing silence as a mode of action in the present-day world of noises all around? In the concept of a Poetics of Silence, 2018, drawing on Wayne Booth's Rhetoric of Fiction, 1961, Enora Lessinger makes a distinction between two types of silence that correspond to what I have called here silence and absence. She examines Kazuo Ishiguro's fiction by separating silence in the narrative from silence of the narrative. First, I will focus on silence as a stylistic tool. You can clearly see that Lessinger is using the method of deconstruction here, the Derridian method here, but she is using different terms, drawing essentially on new criticism. And then the silence, so silence in the story and silence of the story, two types. One is the literal silence in the story, where the characters remain silent, or the silence of the story, what the story does not say or withdraws from or withholds from telling us. Lessinger argues that silence functions here as a narrative strategy. Her focus, though, is on the narrator's unreliability and its implications for the narrative pact and the reader's involvement in the text. In Harold Pinter, A Poetics of Silence, 1970, James Hollis, dealing with Pinter's principal works from his first play, The Room, through his much later play, Silence, 1969, shows that Pinter has created a new poetic in which the real presence, silence, communicates, reflecting fears of real people, searching for basic human needs. In A Tale of Silent Suffering, Wordsworth's Poetics of Silence and Its Function of Reintegration, published in English, 2020. Was published in English Journal of the English Association, volume 69, spring 2020. Even Lowe holds that silence is an important aspect of Wordsworth's treatment of sound and the auditory imagination, noting that while a number of critics have attended to the significance of silence in Wordsworth's poetry, others also have addressed the notion of community in Wordsworth's silence. He argues that their readings encourage a reappraisal of Wordsworth's Poetics of Silence as a mode of mournful reconciliation with forgotten communities. Quote, alert to the ambiguities and contingencies in Wordsworth's consolatory vision, my argument reinforces that social and communal function of silence rather than evaluating its achievement of compensation or reassurance in respect of loss and suffering. Lowe's reading engages with the emergent critical interest in Wordsworth's use of negativity, which is a kind of absence, to offer a renewed perspective on how Wordsworth poeticizes the negative quality. And we also know, of course, of Keats's negative quality that silence lends to sounds and mobilizes the idea of unattainable silence. Rejecting the common dualistic binary opposition between sound and silence, Lowe seeks to redefine the concept of auditory presence and absence to evaluate Wordsworth's Poetics of Silence in terms of its effectiveness as a medium for social, spiritual, and imaginative reintegration. In my present study, I will present deconstructive readings of two poems, William Wordsworth's A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal and Wallace Stevens' The Snowman, in an effort to show the presence of something absent, which is being, as the core of the poem. In each case, I will argue that the poem originates in this absence and proceeds toward an embodiment or beings with a lowercase b, a form of its missing person or thing, or that it makes a thing out of nothing, ex nihilo. So let me read to you the poem. It's only 8-line poem, so I'll just read it to you. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly ears. That's the first stanza. A slumber did my spirit seal. I had no human fears. She seemed a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly ears. Then there is a little gap between the first paragraph and the second paragraph, a little blank space. No motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees, rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. And that's the end of the poem. This is one of his so-called Lucy poems. So who are the central figures in the poem? There is a speaker. The poem is about a girl, she, but she never appears. She never talks. So there is neither physical presence nor verbal presence of she. But she is the center of the poem, because in the first paragraph we are told about what was when she was and what is not when she is not. So there is a transition from the past to the past where she was and the present when she is not. So the poem is this manifestation or embodiment of the speaker's feelings, perceptions, understanding about the world at large, or the whole environment that he lives in, one in the presence of she and in the absence of she, but in the presence of something else. So the central figures in the poem are, one, the speaker, because he is talking to us, he is present. The other, which is she is present Then she is absent, no motion has she now, no force. She neither hears nor sees, but then rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. So suddenly she reappears, not in the physical body that she used to have, but in stones and trees and rocks in nature. So there is presence when she was. A slumber did my spirit seal see. I had no human fears. She seemed. You see, there is an seemed. The poet doesn't say she was. She seemed. She appeared. To whom? The speaker. So she seemed, that's an appearance to the poet. And now she is back again. But the poet says, rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. And the tone here is much more confident. It's not the poet's, she seemed a thing, because the poet doesn't say she was a thing, she seemed a thing. And now he says, rolled round in earth's diurnal course with rocks and stones and trees. She is everywhere, in the green grass and the tall mountains, everywhere. The central event in the poem is that she appears, then disappears, which is muted because there is the blank space between the two stanzas. It's unstated. The poet says not a word about what happened to her, why she died, who killed her, nothing about the central event of the poem, her disappearance. Her death, and now she reappears. So the central event is appearance, disappearance, and reappearance, transformed. The time span and the progression of the event from remote past to recent past and to the present. So there is a time progression it's from the past, recent, remote, recent, and to the present. We know about the remote past. We don't know about the recent past because that's blanked. That's blanked out. But I would suggest that that blank space carries all the traces of the girl, whoever she is. We don't know. Location of the event. Well, for all practical purposes, it is the Lake District of England. Everybody tells us so, because that's where the poet lived. But it's reflected in the speaker's consciousness. The actual location is not the Lake District. It's not the Lake District of the Daffodils poem. 10,000 saw at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. It's not that Lake District. It is the poet's consciousness, the speaker's consciousness, which is also transformed. So there is a corresponding transformation between her and the speaker. What is the cause of the event? The speaker is completely silent about her disappearance. Was it COVID that killed her? Was it disease that killed her? Was it an accident that killed her? Did she drown somewhere? What happened to her? We have no idea. Why doesn't he tell us? Why doesn't he tell us? He seems to know a lot of things about this girl, but he doesn't tell us how she died. Just one word, two words, a simple line, a refrain, something, but the poet is completely silent. So the silence I would propose is deliberate, it's conscious, it is tactful on the part of Wordsworth. What is the effect of the event? The effect, of course, is the speaker is eloquent. The speaker was sleeping in the first stanza. A slumber did my spirit seal. And he had no human fears. Okay, so let's remember that and come to the second stanza. The poet now is a lot more confident, a lot more vocal. Looks like he woke up. It's a wake up experience for him, the passing of the girl. It's a wake up experience for the speaker. And the poem ontologically manifests the missing being in a number of beings. So one person has been missing, has gone, has disappeared, has become nothing. But what has happened? It has become many things, rocks and stones and trees. If we accept this as a basic outline of the poem, several questions arise as to what this 8-line poem says, or more important, it does. Here are a few suggestions. The poem is about a passage of time, then and now. It's about life and death. It is her life, her death, and a second life, a resurrection in one way or other. It's about nature and culture. It's about rural and urban. It's about joy and grief and joy again. It's about transcendentalism, because her reappearance is a transcendental reappearance, or its transcendental existence now compared to what she had before the physical presence. So it's an appearance at a much higher level, in a spiritual level. Victory and triumph over death, fear and apprehension about death. I had no human fears. Who is the person when we are in a company of people and somebody keeps telling, oh, I am not afraid of death, I'm not afraid of death? That's the person who is most afraid of death. Innocence to experience, darkness to light, ignorance to knowledge. The critical event about which the poem tells us nothing is something that happens between two stanzas, just before the declaration, no motion has she now, no force she neither hears nor sees. A cluster of 4 negatives that exponentially intensify the physical absence of everything she embodied. But absence is not silence. Let's remember that. Absence is not silence. For she is silent all through the poem and absent only in the second stanza. Yet she speaks as the other details carry unmistakable traces of her presence, local in the first stanza and global in the second, adding to the poem its transcendental taste. Also, paradoxically, when she was present, she had no voice. But when she is absent, her voice reaches us through the amplified chorus of the rocks and stones and trees. Her silence doesn't affect the speaker. Her absence does. Her absence does, as it is the occasion that gives life to the poem. Her absence is the poem's essence. It is the poem. It's not the poet's consciousness. It's not the poet's fear. It's not the poet's death. It is her absence. Her not being here turns into her being everywhere. The emotional and intellectual weight of the poem rests on her not being with us. The poem's seesaw structure, then, if we make a kind of seesaw, the poem's structure rests on this absent fulcrum. Words in the first stanza keep inviting us to anticipate their absent binaries. Slumber awaits wakefulness. No human fears awakens the lurking fear of ever-present death. She seemed a thing, appearance, vibrates with what was in reality and overtakes our fears. could not feel resonates with her unexpressed, hence absent and silent feelings about passing time. But when the time comes to express these silent sentiments, Wordsworth denies us. He withholds, leaving them to take shape in our individual imaginations. For to give words to these fears would be to rehabilitate our inner life, which would defeat the poem's purpose of keeping Lucy within her imaginary sphere. Now, the second stanza, therefore, though it is already built into the first, the second stanza, which is the blank space, is, I suggest, is erased. The poet probably had a second stanza, but he just took his eraser with his pencil and erased it. Remember, a violet by a mossy stone, half hidden from the eye, half hidden, fair as a star, when only one was shining in the sky. And her absence is reported with a list of negatives: no motion, no force, she neither hears nor sees. Physical attributes. The frozen space between the two stanzas serves as her burial ground, the only sign of presence for the one who has remained absent throughout the poem. For many years after Wordsworth's death in 1850, A Slumber Did My Spirit Seal was thought to be one of his Lucy poems. Inspired by the passing of Lucy, a young girl who lived in the Lake District and died very young. The poet, it was said, knew Lucy and loved her, and her death traumatized him. I see that we have one of the speakers, one of the presentations here on trauma studies, which I have missed already, Professor Herndon. So anyway, Wordsworth's biographers have since concluded that Lucy was a fabrication by the poet to feed the imagination of his critics. And there is no evidence of her birth or death in the church records of the time. If we accept the poem as an emotional response to Lucy's loss, then arguably Wordsworth created Lucy to kill her and then mourn her passing. But this rages, the poem is a drama then. The poet creates a character, kills her, and then writes a poem about her passing away. But this raises more questions than answers. Why did he create an innocent child, kept her silent, and then resurrected her into an overhanging presence? One answer is that the poet's profound dependence on Lucy, an unsubstantial spirit that pervades the poet's imagination prior to the existence of the poem, supplies the architectural design, its layout, and substance by innuendo. A real Lucy, alive or dead, would render the poem a meaningless expression of memorial grief. In Empty Spaces and the Poetics of Silence, in the poetry of John Keats, Jean-Marie Fournier shows a similar pattern of configuration of absence, void, in John Keats's poetry. In Sleep and Poetry, she says, Keats was trying to, quote, come to terms with the intuition of a void, of silent space, present at the center of the text or of the poetic experience that leads to it. Or, to put it more radically, with the absence of sense, similar to that experienced by Wordsworth when he declares himself haunted by the sounding cataracts of his youth and of nature in Tintern Abbey, or when he realizes that he is incapable of understanding what the leech gatherer tells him at the end of Resolution and Independence, and hears only a kind of background rumble instead. This sudden breaking down of experience into sheer nonsense is the epiphanic intuition of the real, according to Fournier. Leaning on Lacan's concept, we can say here that the given, though insistent, is, however, merely absurd and meaningless, the stuff of nothingness. And the materialism our life is made of. One may look at Lucy as the personification of a similar void, an emptiness from which the poem takes shape as compensation for the poet's sense of loss and despair, and of course, fear of death. One word I have not used so far is sunyabad or sunyata, the Sanskrit words. The state of existential emptiness where external phenomena are interiorized. Lucy is the perfect manifestation of this nodal, nothingness, as she first fills the speaker with one sort of fullness, and herself reduced to nothing, fills him with a richer fullness, Purnat Purnamada Purnameva Vasishyate. Her physical presence, thus, is immaterial, for the infinite remains immutable. For the poet, the existential transition he undergoes or she undergoes is a paradox of the fortunate fall, Felix Kalpa. It supplies the words to express the ineffable. Okay, let's jump to Wallace Stevens. Stevens, the Snowman, is an invitation to experience such an existential state of emptiness, and the winter landscape serves as the object of his observation. The Snowman. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers sagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. For the listener who listens in the snow and nothing himself beholds nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. Stevens opens the poem with a series of juxtapositions, as we see, of what is present followed by what is absent. But the twist here is that all that is present in the winter landscape remains beyond physical experience of the observer, while all that is absent is encumbered. One must have a mind of winter, which is a precondition for what follows, is clearly the necessary perceptual consciousness to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow. It brings up the question, what is a mind of winter? The poet's opening narrative helps define its faint boundaries. It is an absent perspective described with collateral associated observations. To regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow. We are not sure whether the frost and the snow are present or absent. They come into our consciousness radar only after we have a mind of winter. So it's a circular logic Stevens presents us. One must have a mind of winter to see all of these things. In other words, if we don't see them, then we don't have a mind of winter. So we are not eligible. We are not qualified to see what we want to see. Then, and have been cold a long time, another second precondition. For what? To behold the junipers sagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun. And two, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place. And of course, the same bare place means it's absent, it's void of anything. The ambiguity as to whether the experiential wonders, junipers sagged with ice, the spruces, the distant glitter of the January sun, and the misery surrounding them are out there in the landscape, or they emanate from the viewer's consciousness remains unresolved. The final stanza deepens this doubt, further blurring the boundary between what is present on the scene and what is absent. It is a declarative sentence with a grammatical subject, the listener who listens in the snow. An imaginary presence, absent in reality but present in the accoutrements of winter. The verb for this subject is beholds, entangles the subject listener with a condition and nothing himself. So this listener must be nothing himself, must empty himself of everything in order to see. See what? See what is not there and see what is there. You see there? And nothing himself. How will the listener vacate himself from the observation post, make himself nothing? It's probably, maybe somebody will say, well, it's the old biblical concept of kenosis. Jesus told people to empty themselves. So if you empty your soul, your spirit, it will be filled with the presence of God. That is the critical dilemma in the poem, how something will evolve only out of nothing. It is not for Stevens, something leads to something else. No, something will always come out of nothing. Nothing is where, nothing is in the observer. Stevens appears to approach an explanation for this conundrum in the final lines, but drags us into an intriguing phenomenological puzzle. The final line complicates the poet's demands on the listener, on us by implication, even further for the two grammatical objects of beholds, nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. Two nothings that are contingent on the listener's ability and willingness to make himself nothing. The spirit of winter awaits the absence or vacancy of the listener to materialize itself. Only from nothing the new something can come, which is to say that the winter and its beauty are a pervasive presence. The viewer or the listener will see and hear what he wishes to the degree that he is capable of self-extinction. This self-extinction or self-annihilation, or at least a self-negation of the listener or reader, is a narrative pact Stevens sets in place for us to experience the beauty and wonder of the snowman, and not think of the associated misery it brings. Because if you have a mind of winter, you will not feel the cold. I mean, you have to live. You don't live in a tropical hot climate and then not feel that the snowman is cold. You have to have a mind of winter. And not to say, the narrative strategy plays on a utopian vision of natural beauty, absent, but comes into being only when the mind is ready to receive it. Both poems, I suggest, may be read as allegories of creation, the poets standing godlike over their encounter with a void that eventually yields the fruit of their imagination. In the preface to Lyrical Ballads, yes, Wordsworth described this process as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, originating in emotions recollected in tranquility. However, a slumber points to something before the powerful feelings and their overflow, before the emotions and their recollection, something independent of the speaker's presence. The snowman, similarly, implores the reader, the listener, who listens in the snow, to be nothing himself, to partake in everything that is there and everything that is missing. Thank you all. That's it.
Thank you so much, sir. I mean, it was such a play between presence and absence, and most importantly, silence, that
Yes.
ultimately has enveloped all the audience. Oh, yes. I would request the participants to come up with certain questions to make the session more vibrant. Yes. You can type it here, or if you wish, you can speak again. I mean, you can speak, no issue with that.
Okay, if you don't ask me questions, I'll feel that it was not a good talk. What are all the graduate students?
Yes, we have someone.
Okay.
But this is a kind of useful and informative lecture. It's a kind of appreciation. It's a kind
Now,
of appreciation.
you can, I think if you agree with the principle of the silence and negation, you can apply it to other genre of literature. For example, in drama, people like Harold Pinter, people like oh, plays like Waiting for Godot, for example,
Right.
Samuel Beckett. They have experimented with this silence a lot, very deliberately and very carefully and very technically. They have mastered or explored the idea of silence. Silence which is so vibrant, silence which is so vocal. And you can also see that we have used other kinds of words to express something, such as, for example, a play like Desire Under the Elms. The tree there becomes a kind of constantly present something, a spirit hanging over the family. The son, the father, other children, all of them, they are always under the mother, under their mother, dead mother. The mother is dead. Okay. Or we can look at something else like the tree that was planted in All My Sons, in Arthur Miller's All My Sons, for the son who has died. And when the play opens, he tells us, or we are told, that the tree has come down, which is, of course, a clear indication. So it's a symbolic, metaphorical, whatever you say. But there is that notion of absence and silence, and how through silence artists make people, characters, and objects, even objects, talk.
So, sir, we have a couple of questions now in the chat box.
Okay.
And the first question, which is asked by Pooja, you have already answered, as she has inquired about certain texts which deal with the poetics of absence. So this is what we have been talking about, be it Waiting for Godot or Pinter's plays or so many other plays which we have just mentioned. We have a next question from Veronica Hart, and she is asking, you spoke about the silence of Hindu and Buddhism meditative practices. Are there any other practices that artists may use to incorporate into their art?
Okay. If you read texts, Buddhist texts like Madhyamika, and I'm not a scholar of Buddhism by any means, but I have read some Buddhist scriptures, but Buddhists believe in silence as a mode of communication. And a lot of Western scholars are picking up on that Buddhist concept now. And of course, in Vedic language, we have single simple words, just one word, not even a word, a sound, produce so much meaning or produce so many thoughts, ideas. So the Western dichotomy, the Western conundrum, what I said, the paradox, how can something come out of nothing? So that nothing is not absence of everything, but it's an absence that we don't see. And that's where I think the phenomenological research or thinking of Heidegger and other phenomenological thinkers, where is the truth? Is it out there, or it's a consciousness of the observer? Where is it? What is the age-old question? If there is nobody to see it, did the tree fall in the forest? That's a funny question that everybody talks about. But that was the basic notion of this Heideggerian principle, or the other phenomenological thinkers. So when we are again, think of the word nothing. Nothing. What is nothing? We have in the state of Odisha, where I am from, there is a song. It's a joke that there was 990. The crow came and took the nothing out of it. How much is left and how much is gone? Think of it. 990. Which one is nothing? The zero is the nothing. A crow came and picked up the nothing. So how much did the crow take? It's only 99 left out of 990. Is that true? So again, I think in very rural areas of India, older people and even uneducated, illiterate people have jokes on this idea of the nothing. The nothing is not nothing. I know India is known for its philosophical theorization of the zero, nothing. And that nothing is not the absence of everything. And that's what I said, absence is not silence. And silence is not absence either. If you don't hear any sound, it doesn't mean there is no sound. You just can't hear it. Sometimes the dog hears a sound that you and I cannot hear it. So there is a sound, but we don't hear it. So when I said something is created out of nothing, it is in the biblical sense, in the theological sense. How did Brahma make the world in Indian theology? How did the Brahma, the creator of the universe, make the universe in the Eastern concept? Think about it. Did he just, like magic, like Satya Sai Baba, raise his hand in the air and there comes the gold chain? Did it do that? Or did something really happen? What do our Puranas speak about it? How do we explain this whole thing coming out of nothing? Or is that nothing something? If it is something, what is it? And that's what I'm looking at, that the writing of poetry is nothing less than, again, I'm using the word nothing, is no less, let me use the word no less than what God did in creating the world. What does Genesis say in the Bible, book 1? God said, let there be light. Where the hell did it come from? Where did light come from? Just like that, let there be light and there was light. Let there be wind and there was wind. Let there be trees, there are trees. And on the other hand, the Greek mythology says, what I talked about, the story of Hephaestus. Hephaestus was told by Zeus, the god, to create a new animal with a window on the chest. So if I want to see who I am, or if somebody else wants to see who I am or what is inside me, the core material, then all that person needs to do is just come and look through the window, peek inside the wood, and see what is there. But Hephaestus, in his haste, forgot. He made a mistake. He is blundered. And that blunder made human beings the most mysterious of all living things. A dog doesn't like to cheat us. A lion doesn't cheat us. People cheat. People lie. And people hide things from us. Why? Because there is no window on the chest of human beings. So what is that core? Who am I? What is the core material? In Jagannath's temple in Puri, for example, there is a core. The core is supposed to have been found in the ocean. And it is something that came from the heavens, the old gods, that Krishna was in the form of that little piece, whatever it is. And that was brought and put inside the statue of Jagannath. Nobody knows what it is. Because the person who puts it in there, his hands are covered with 10 layers of clothes. And the person, how many? I think 14, 19 or 14 or something, 14 or 19 years, the old statue is thrown, destroyed, and a new statue is placed, and the core is transferred from one to the other. But nobody sees it, nobody touches it, and that is supposed to be the core of divinity, divine something. And yet, some people say that the old man who usually transfers the core material from the old god to the new god dies soon after. And that person doesn't feel anything, doesn't know anything. It's from ignorance to ignorance. So this whole notion of what is the core of the... And when we as critics, when we as readers read a poem and we ask, what does this poem mean? What are we looking for? What is at the heart of the poem? And what is at the heart of the poem? If we go with Wallace Stevens, it is what we want to see. You think of reader response? You know, there are 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, and yours might as well be the 14th way of looking at it. And you are no more right or no more wrong than the next person. I had, incidentally, I had a lot of discussion about this with Mr. Brooks himself, Client Brooks, because he changed toward his last life. he changed many of the new critical theoretical concepts. Just wanted to show you this young fellow from Odisha sitting with Clint Brooks. And this was in his own living room. We had coffee together, and a wonderful gentleman. And a man who never, here is a critic and a scholar, probably the best America has produced, whose book, Understanding Poetry, is used as the syllabus of teaching English. Not syllabus, the, how shall I put it? It is the Bible of teaching English in high schools and colleges. But he was not afraid to say that he wanted to change his mind. That some of the early opinions he had expressed in 1938 in Understanding Poetry, he changed them toward his last stage of his life. Anyway, does anybody else have any questions?
Yes, sir. We will take up one more question.
Okay.
This is from Artika. She's asking, sir, you mentioned that the one who claims that she is not afraid of death is actually afraid. Can this be seen with a transcendental lens? Shunyata or nothingness go beyond life and death. What do you have to say about this?
Now, what is Sunita? Did you say?
Shunyata, sir. Void.
Sunyata. Oh,
Right.
okay. Okay. No, Sunyata and Sunyabad, I didn't go into it, but Sunyata and Sunyabad, it's part of Indian Vedic philosophy and Vedic knowledge. How you take zero out of zero and there is still zero remains. So you take nothing out of nothing and there will still be nothing. In other words, nothingness is nothing different from infinity. What happens when we take one or two or three things from infinity? There is still infinity. Or do we call it infinity minus 3? Infinity remains infinity, it's changeless. And in that sense, we can say probably a poem's meaning, whatever we make of it, whether in this century or 100 years later, it stays where it is. It doesn't go away anywhere. And that is why Archibald MacLeish said, a poem doesn't have to mean, it just is. A poem just is. You make whatever you want to make out of it. If you have a mind of winter, you can see the snowman. If you have a mind of summer, you can see the crabs and the fish from the lake. And so Sunyata is that it has to be developed even more, I think, which I didn't do. I agree with her, because Sunyata is not absence thing. When we say Sunya, it doesn't mean nothing is there. There is something. We have to see it. Even when, and that's part of life too, even when we think that there is nothing more in life left, there is a lot left. What comes before life and what comes after death? Nothing. Before we are born. What comes after we are gone? Nothing. Is that true? No. So that the whole concept of nothing or absence, taking away of the essence. But essence can always come out of absence. In fact, essence can come out of only absence. Only out of nothing will something come. Remember King Lear? When Cordelia says he doesn't have nothing more to say, the father says, the stupid old man, King Lear says, say something. Nothing will come out of nothing. And the little girl, who is very intelligent and smart, she says, no, father, I have nothing more to say. Nothing will come out of nothing. And King Lear is so wrong, and he is proved wrong at the end of the play. Okay.
So we have one more question, but I think you have already discussed that aspect. The question is, what is your view of existence of God in theory of absence and presence? So already when you talked about Jagannath temple and other sorts of things, I think you briefly touched that aspect as well.
Well, somebody is trying to put me in a tight spot, so I'm not going to talk about God. For all practical purposes, I am God.
Right.
My name is Sura. Sura means God.
Sura. And Rath as well, sir.
Well, I have a middle name, Prasad, so I'm a gift of God.
Right. So, Rachna, do we have to do something in between, or should I go and offer vote of thanks to sir? And what about the photograph? What would you say?
Yes, Bhaiya. After the vote of thanks, we are going to close the meeting and we'll join again at 12:15 for the next
Right,
session.
right.
Okay, all
So,
right.
it has really been a kind of pleasure, and the way sir reread and reinterpreted the two poems, Wallace Stevenson's Snowman and Wordsworth's classic poem. That again, I'm quite hopeful that this must have given ample insight to the audience in terms of newer ways of interpretations. And as far as this presence, absence, and silence is concerned, again, as I've been talking in the very beginning, that has been tricky, intriguing. At this juncture, I simply seem to remind of some lines from Wordsworth's poem Tintern Abbey, where he says that, and I have felt a presence that disturbs me with joy of elevated thoughts,
Yes.
a sense sublime of something for more deeply infused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky and in the mind of man.
Yes.
Emotion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Thank you so much, sir, for this insight which you have inculcated amongst us. Looking
Thank you.
forward to see you once again in your future. Uh, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed being in the
Thank
company
you,
of.
sir.
Bye.
Namaskar to all of you. So we are again in the second session of the day third of this FTP. And in this session, we're indeed privileged to have a talk by Merin Simi, who happens to be an assistant professor in English in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Institute of Technology, Madras, India. She happens to be one of the research investigators of the Center for Memory Studies, IIT Madras, and the founding chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies. which is the first national network in Asia under the Aegis of the International Memory Studies Association, MSA. Her research interests include memory studies, historiography studies, Anglo-Indian studies, Kerala modernity, and digital humanities. She has the credit to co-edit a volume on Anglo-Indian identities, past and present in India and the diaspora, which is published from Palgrave Macmillan quite recently, 2021. Today, ma'am shall enlighten us. In fact, she will initiate us, or she will inspire us to have a fresh perspective on the status of memory studies in India, which has quite recent studies to the best of our information, and not all of us have the access to what is this memory studies. So with the kind of eagerness which you may have, I too share that. I invite Merin ma'am to enlighten us about memory studies in general, and particular in the case of India. Merin ma'am, most welcome.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible. Yes.
Thank you for your very kind invite, and thank you, Dr. Singh, for this very generous introduction. And thank you very much, Dr. Rachana Pandey, for reaching out. And it's an absolute delight to be here to interact with other colleagues who are teaching in different parts of the country. And also during this pandemic, I must also acknowledge that, despite the many difficulties and challenges that we face, this online platform has made it possible for a lot of us to interact with each other in ways that it was not possible in the earlier times. So I thank you for your time, and I hope you've been having a very engaging a range of sessions in the FTP that is organized by the Institute. So today I want to very briefly interact with you on the possibilities of research in memory studies in India. So just to give a preview to what I would be sharing shortly. So we do have a center, as Dr. Singh also very kindly pointed out, we have a center for memory studies here at IIT Madras. And we have also been, we are also part of the first national network, Indian Network for Memory Studies, which is registered under the Memory Studies Association Amsterdam. So we've been in the past 2.5 years or so, we've been engaged in a lot of pointed research on memory studies, and we've been encouraging a network of researchers, and we did a few workshops where we were trying to bring together a pool of researchers, young researchers, very experienced ones, and to see how we could make use of this new domain in terms of exploring newer forms of knowledge, newer kinds of texts as well as context. So memory studies as such, it's a very, very young discipline in a sense. Memory studies as a term can get a lot of traction only from the mid 20th century onwards, or even fairly towards the fag end of the 20th century. But memory, as we know, has always been part of all the narratives, all the stories that we have been producing as nations, as communities, as individuals. So what memory studies as a particular discipline, as a particular domain, it does to give it a formal structure, give it the structure of a discipline, give it some tools and certain theoretical frameworks, certain models to work with. So I will first briefly talk about the kind of work that we do here at the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras, and then open up a few range of resources and a range of projects that we are engaged in, and see how best we could perhaps take this ahead as in a collaborative sense, or perhaps see if there are things, there are particular strands that are of interest to you. So there are three terms that I would like to foreground at the beginning in terms of situating our work, and also in locating the possibilities ahead in terms of the research that we could conduct within memory studies. One is, of course, the term interdisciplinary. Yeah. So much of this work that we do, and memory studies is a domain to, by default, it is an interdisciplinary domain. And the work that we have been trying to do, the kind of collaborations that we have been having, it's all very, very firmly rooted and surrounded by various interdisciplinary techniques and various interdisciplinary frameworks. So in that sense, we do have an ongoing interaction with a number of disciplines such as history, anthropology, urban geography, and we have also been in the last 1.5 years, in fact, pushing the limits of these disciplinary framework, and also connecting very, very forthcomingly with neuroscientists, with people who are working on brain science and memory. And also a large part of our work is also in digital humanities, trying to bridge the gap between the traditional humanities disciplines and the various forms of newer technology. So, and in fact, just a couple of months back, we had set up the XR lab, which is also one of the earliest initiatives from any humanities department. So we have an XR lab which takes care of the augmented reality and the virtual reality aspects, and see how that could engage, those newer forms of technology could engage in a very deliberate and direct ongoing dialogue with various forms of literary avenues that we are otherwise familiar with, trained in. So I myself, I am trained in literary studies, so I'm a student of literature, so I try and stay focused on my own discipline. And much of the work that we do over here is also in terms of we try and accentuate this the significance of staying rooted in one's discipline, then branching out to the other various interdisciplinary domains. Yeah. So we will talk more about this as and when we make progress with this session. So the first term is interdisciplinary. The second one is transnational. Yeah. So we do know that much of the research in the 20th century was focused on largely on the national boundaries, because 20th century was also the time when nations and post-colonial nations were getting formed in very formal ways. So there are a lot of binaries around which knowledge construction and the building of scholarship had been happening in the 20th century. One being the one that is closest to home for us is the colonial, post-colonial boundary. So much of the work, much of the interdisciplinary work that we have been trained to do was also within these locations, within these mostly binary locations, which were, I'm just using the term post-colonial in a very loose sense in order to make, to highlight certain continuities and signify certain departures. Yeah. So our thrust is, in fact, in focusing on the transnational aspect of memory studies research. Yeah. So in that sense, I'll very briefly talk about the research that we have on the Anglo-Indian community and also on the Jewish community who are settled in different parts of primarily, the Jewish community was settled in the southern part of India. So we are trying to focus on certain ways in which the boundaries have been transcended, and thus explore, the newer ways in which forms of knowledge, forms of scholarship, and more importantly, newer frameworks of understanding scholarship could develop. The third term that I would like to focus is slow memory. Yeah. So I'll also, talk about this in detail later on. So what we have in mind when we talk about slow memory is something like an everyday memory, for lack of a better word. Yeah. Because in the 20th century, from the, from the early 20th century onwards, much of the events that got attention, at the national scale and an international scale, were also events of such a mega proportion. It could be an event like partition, an event like Holocaust, because much of memory studies, in fact, it revolves around Holocaust studies, trauma studies, were very World War studies. They were very intricately connected with memory studies for the longest time. Yeah. So while that remains very, very important, what we are also interested is in pursuing other forms of everyday memory, because there is also an ordinary form of memory, a kind of memory, which gets built up and which needs to be located on in an everyday basis. There may not be mega events like Holocaust or partition or emergency, or a war or a refugee crisis, or a catastrophe which happens. But there could be these very slow kind of events which also influence the nation, the community, individuals in perhaps in equal ways, and sometimes in more distressing ways. To a pandemic, for instance, it's a very, very clear example of how slow memory could operate. It didn't happen on one day, because we can't locate on the one day when the pandemic happened and went away. And we are, I think we are a generation who are actually living this in so many ways on a day-to-day basis, and each of our stories are very different. We do, whether we have been infected by the virus or not, we all have been affected in various ways. The trauma has been of different kinds. It need not be just the trauma of death, just the trauma of isolation. It's something, this is stress. It's a story of different degrees that we are living it out on a daily basis. Yeah. So slow memory in that sense, that is something that we are deeply interested in. We also have an ongoing project on slow memory with the Cost Action, one of the European funding centers, where we are looking at how slow memory is affecting and changing the day-to-day lives in different parts of the world, and trying to formulate some models through which we can look at it. Yeah. So just to give some idea into the kind of theoretical tools that we look at when we are engaging with memory studies research, we are interested equally in the micro models of memory as well as the macro models of memory. The micro models in terms of how memory functions, the neural networks, how you remember on a daily basis. It could be, nowadays when we think about, remembering, storing, preserving memory, it's not just in the brain. And then you could also, and if you look back at the ways in which human brain has been wired to remember, to store memory, we have come a long way. Yeah. Maybe one of the earliest technology interventions in terms of storing memory was, books. Yeah. Man always had, fundamentally humankind always had this tendency to find an external drive, to store everything. Yeah. So the journey started with an intervention with, manuscripts, and then, with advanced technology, it became printing and books. And then, we went through a series of things in the following centuries with photography, with, the motion picture coming in. And now we have come to a point when we as an individual, we do not have an existence on our own without our gadgets. Yeah. Even if we think about this current mode in which we are communicating, we are very heavily and in a very tangible sense dependent on these various gadgets and this invisible network which surrounds us. So in terms of memory, the very way in which we understand the term memory has been undergoing a lot of change, and we are interested in looking at those very micro models in which memory operates, memory manifests, memory is preserved. We're also interested in the macro models, the cultural model of memory. So these are both aspects that we are looking at, and we are also, as I mentioned, trying to transition from this big event framework towards a slow memory model. Yeah. So when I say that, I would also like to reiterate that both the human interface in terms of memory studies and the machine interface, both are equally important in the kind of research that we are trying to do. Yeah. For instance, today, if we are trying to locate a nation's history, a community's history, it is very difficult to stay away from perhaps, the many machine modeled storytelling frameworks which are there all around, the social media being one of them. Yeah. So there are stories which are being narrated, which are being retold, which are being revisited, not just in through those traditional forms of textbooks and archives and those were the earlier repositories of memory, repositories of knowledge. Now everything, there has been a paradigm shift, and I would like to say that the pandemic has in some sense validated this shift all the more, because there was a time when certain forms of knowledge production, certain forms of knowledge dissemination were looked down upon rather than the other. Now we have come to a point when this seems to be the only way in which, at least for the time being, we can communicate, we can disseminate knowledge, we can engage in processes of knowledge production together. Yeah. So keeping that in mind, I would also, like to highlight the context in which we are engaging in this discussion. Yeah, and it is in this context that I would like to highlight the importance of seeing how our teaching trajectories and our research trajectories need to blend in some form or the other. Because most of us, I believe, this being an FTP program, I presume most of us are teachers in different capacities and working in different colleges, teaching at various levels. Yeah, so increasingly we all have come to realize that the trajectory of academic career is like, you get into research so that you can get into a teaching career, and then in order to make further advancement, you continue to do research. Yeah, so the trajectory is fundamentally research, teaching, research. Yeah, so when we are now thinking about professional development, when we are thinking about accentuating our professional career, this is a combination that we are thinking of. Gone are the days where everything began and ended in the classroom. We know that the classroom research the classroom interaction has to be supplemented by the research outside, and the research outside should again feed into the teaching in the classroom, because nowadays the classroom activities are also not in the traditional form of the teacher imparting knowledge and the students passively consuming it. There are projects involved, as we know. There are MA projects. There are these short-term assignments that college students interact in. So this linkage is very, very strong. The linkage between research and teaching. So how do we strengthen this linkage further? So this is where I want to position the role of memory as a framework. The role that memory studies as a as a research domain could very, very actively play. Yeah, so you would find that same. I'm also positioning this word network over here. Yeah, so we do know that the earlier in the way the humanities research operated, most of us worked in these very solitary mode. You work on one paper, you just do your own research. The concept of lab and all were outside the scope of the imagination of humanities education. Yeah, but the times are really changing, and I am using this session also as an opportunity to highlight the need for those forms of collaborative research. Yeah, and one could collaborate with colleagues, with students, and now I do believe that the online networking in this pandemic situation has opened up more avenues for us to. I'm speaking for our own research body over here at the Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras. We've been able to collaborate more actively and directly in these couple of years. Because there's no hassle of travel. There are also these practical implications. It is more cost effective as well. You can have the Zoom meetings, you can meet in Google Meet, and there is much which could be done. Yeah. So before we get into the theoretical framings and details, this is something that I would like to underscore and leave with you as a thought. If you do not have an active network, a collaborative network yet, maybe this is a time to start building it. You could start within your own department, see what are the areas that that could align within the same discipline, outside the discipline. There are multiple ways in which you can take a research forward. And memory studies, I'm again highlighting this, it is by default a very interdisciplinary framework that you can approach it from the point of view of literary studies. You can come in from the point of history, of course. You can come in if you are interested in technology. That's another way in which you could come in. And if the scientific part of it, if the let's say the neural part of it, if that is what interests a colleague of yours who works in a science department, you could bring him or her in as well. Yeah, so there are multiple opportunities, and this is a discipline, a domain which would thrive in its interdisciplinarity. Yeah. So I would also, in terms of the various contexts that could come together, just highlighting some of the things that domains that we have been trying to bring together within the Center for Memory Studies. We bring in literary studies, of course, cultural studies, digital humanities, Anglo-Indian studies, modernity studies, from the perspective of the post-colonial modernity as well as from the colonial modernity, masculinity studies, medical humanities, and of late, we've also been actively interacting with cognitive scientists and people who are working on brain science and memory from different parts of the world. One of our recently concluded workshops on cognition and memory, it very directly looked at these different combinations and on how they could say give us newer models of storytelling in the sense of, telling the story of communities, telling the story of nations, and even, the story of various disciplines evolving at different levels. Yeah. So just the way I highlighted at the beginning, there are three things that we have been focusing on: the interdisciplinary framework, the transnational approach, and a slow memory, which is largely enabled by technology as well. Yeah. So having said that, it is perhaps important for us to also take a look at how the relation between history, memory, and identity have been evolving from the 19th century onwards, particularly maybe more significantly from the early 20th century onwards. Yeah. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my session, yeah, the early 20th century was a very, very compelling moment in world history. I'm just just for the sake of convenience, I'm making it very, very general and very loose. Yeah. So the early 20th century was a time when the world order began to change radically, and the two world wars, as we know, it completely changed the configuration of the world, the politics of the international politics, the colonial, post-colonial relation, everything was changed radically during those times. So first, the 4 decades were, very, very, very epoch-making. And, even when we look at the history, which is closer to our part of the world, we will know that, the 1940s was the time, when we clearly made a shift and asserted ourselves as a post-colonial nation. There was, of course, there is this fascination of starting journey as a new nation. There was also simultaneously certain kinds of things which were by default, we were required to forget or forced to forget. Yeah, in terms of, there is a very murky history of partition that you wouldn't want to always draw upon. There is a murky history of, different identities, certain identities getting foregrounded and certain identities getting erased, and some forms of storytelling, some forms of, history telling becoming more dominant than the other. Some of you who are familiar with post-colonial writings and subaltern writings would have perhaps discussed this at length over your research career too. Yeah. So just to situate our the framing of any work in memory studies, yeah, it's important to see how the relation between history, memory, and identity had been evolving from the earliest times onwards. So if I were to give a historical trajectory to this, and I do believe that history and historiography, they play a very, very fundamental role in defining, in fact, most disciplines across humanities as well as sciences. Historiography is very, very important because much of what we do, much of what we are framed by the historically compelling moments. It could be a war, it could be a policy decision, it could be something very local which happened, it could be something which had an international impact. Yeah. So because again using the pandemic as a key example, this shows that it's everything is very, very historically rooted. Yeah. Because the way we interact now, the way our systems, our mechanisms of work now are heavily influenced by this historical moment, which incidentally has affected the entire globe too. So coming back to this point, yeah, if I were to divide the history of mankind, I'm using a very, very broad and crude, a very loose sort of a definition. If we assume that there's a pre-modern stage, a modern phase, and a postmodern stage, which it's easy to say that conveniently we are inhabiting the postmodern stage. Yeah. So if you're looking at the pre-modern stage, yeah, that was a time when the writing of history was equated, very directly equated with preserving memory. Yeah. Because if you think about, as students of literature, if you think about the earliest forms of manuscripts and the earliest forms of history telling and storytelling available, think about Beowulf, for instance. Yeah, there is a way in which the writing of the storytelling was also about legitimating certain kinds of belief systems, or or perhaps the Anglo-Saxon chronicles. Yeah, take the crudest and the loosest form of literature, form of history that you can think about. Over there you will find that there's a very clear equation between the writing of history and the preserving of certain kinds of identities. And those sort of works, if you push it harder, you would find that they also had an additional function of legitimizing. Yeah, they were expected to legitimize either a certain religious belief, or the life of certain kings, or certain mythical sort of structures and systems. Yeah, so in a nutshell, in the pre-modern stage, identity was something very, very closely related to writing of history, to the preserving of memory, and they had a twin function because they also operated within these institutions of either the church or the state. And we do know, how things happened during those times, yeah, across different cultures, across different traditions. So there was a very, very pointed legitimizing function. You wrote these so that certain things could be preserved. And what was the aim of that preservation? What was the objective of that preservation? So that those identities will be legitimized. You praise the kings overtly because of that. You praise certain structures overtly. You praise certain belief systems overtly. And there's a very black and white way in which history and memory was documented and preserved then. Yeah, again, I'm reiterating, in order to preserve or legitimize certain forms of identities over the other. So in the pre-modern stage, in a very broad sense, this is something, Aleda Osman, who's one of the leading theorists of memory studies, she also has compellingly been arguing, in the pre-modern stage, the connection between history and memory was very, very close. Yeah, history wasn't seen as superior than memory. Whatever one is writing from memory was seen almost like history. Again, if you are, I believe that most of us are also students of literature. If you brush up what we did as history of as part of our history of literature courses, yeah, you would know that most of the earliest works also have a historical potential. They are not seen as purely literary works, yeah, even if they are like just diary entries, they do have a historical potential as well. So that was the connection between history and memory. And then in the modern phase, which is perhaps maybe the post-Renaissance phase, the post-Enlightenment phase, whichever way you would like to call it, and in some sense that's also the time when colonization begins to take over in a big way in different parts of the world. Yeah. And that is also, I particularly use the phase of colonization because, that's also the part of global history that is closest to our part of the world. Yeah. So if we think about the modern phase, you find that there is a certain sense of polarization. Yeah. In terms of, there is a disinterested form of objectivity is seen as a good move towards good scholarship, towards good history. Yeah. So mixing up history and identity are not seen as a good thing. There is a presumably, there is a certain supposed form of objectivity which is injected into all forms of scholarship, all forms of knowledge. Yeah. Identity is not seen as a very good thing. Yeah. And regardless of a person's identity, gender, class, region, everything, there is a phase in the modern in the modern phase of history writing, this clear polarization is there where objective history telling is foregrounded more than the other. So that in fact culminates in the early 20th century in different forms of history writing, which is why there's also this very clear division between what is a testimonial, what is a subjective history, and what is an objective history. Those things are debated now, but we are talking about the relatively modern phase when this polarization happens. Yeah. So history and memory are not seen as the same thing. On the contrary, memory is seen as slightly inferior in this stage, where history is seen as more objective and memory is seen as very, very biased, where something very subjective, which cannot be taken with which cannot be verified, which cannot be seen as authentic, yeah, which is seen with a lot of suspicion. And where have we reached now? If again, I'm using the term postmodern in a very loose and convenient sense. In this postmodern stage that we inhabit, yeah, there is a complementary way in which history and memory are operating, yeah, because there's also this increased realization, particularly maybe from the 1960s and 1970s, that objective history is also a biased construction of political memory. Yeah, there is nothing objective, and bias of and talking about bias and memory, we are all in fact very, very biased beings. Yeah, because human brain is a very, very biased it operates in a with a very biased mechanism. If you think about anything at all, you see 7 colors and you would always have a preference for 1 or 2, yeah, and it operates in a very fundamental sense also, with a certain inherent bias. So if anyone wants to do this, a biased free approach towards anything, we are not actually, human brain is not wired towards that. So that might reflect in a all kinds of research that we do, all kinds of approaches and frameworks that we have. And I think, we are now, all forms of scholarship, forms of knowledge have also come to a point where, this could be factored in, this could be accounted for. The bias is not seen as essentially something which has always to be avoided. Yeah, I'm sure, I hope you're with me and you are trying to understand the term bias in a very healthy sense too. Yeah. So now we have come to a point where an interaction between history and memory is again validated. It's again celebrated, not in the way that it happened in the pre-modern stage. The way it happens now is very, very different. Not necessarily always to legitimize, not necessarily always to memorialize something, but this interaction becomes very important in order to situate the different forms of storytelling, whether it's a fictional mode of storytelling or the storytelling of a nation. It becomes very, very important. Just to give you a very quick example about how memory and history sits together in the contemporary, and how it affects the modes of storytelling. Yeah? So Margaret Atwood, I'm sure you're familiar with Margaret Atwood, the Canadian author. Yeah. So in one of her prose pieces, In Search of Alia's Grace, yeah, she talks about a certain experience, and she uses that experience, that anecdote, to show how memory, history, and story intersect, how they all intersect. And I do believe that that is, in the forms of cultural memory, as well as in the everyday forms of memory that we are looking at, this is a good model to keep in mind. Yeah. So I'll just read out a brief excerpt from Margaret Atwood's, In Search of Alia's Grace. Yeah. So maybe, to make it easier, I could just perhaps copy paste that and leave it in the chat. Yes. Yeah. So I'll just now read this out from the chat box, yeah, for our benefit. When I lived in the rural Ontario countryside, north of Toronto, a local man said, "There's the barn where we hid the women and children." That time, the Fenians invaded. An individual barn, individual women and children. The man who told me about the barn was born some 60 years after the Fenian attack, but he said we, not they. He was remembering as a personal experience an event at which he had not been present in the flesh, and I believe we have all done that. It is at such points that memory, I think, it got cut. Yeah. Yeah. It is at this point that memory, history, and story all intersect. Yeah. So this, in fact, if you think about, if you kind of map this anecdote into our own personal experiences, into the forms of national storytellings that we are used to, you'd find that we have done this too many times. We continue to do that as well. Yeah, because when we talk about sometimes about a family history, or about our ancestors, or about our the leaders of the nation. Yeah, sometimes we use we even for those instances that we were not part of. For instance, if you talk about the 1930s and say we fought the British. Yeah, I was not there. You and I were not there in flesh and blood, but we partake in that history. Yeah, that's how cultural memory. That's how collective memory works. Yeah, and this is something which has become part and parcel of the way in which we tell stories. Yeah, which is why in the postmodern interactive stage we live with an increased sense of awareness that it is difficult to say where subjective history ends and objective history begins. Yeah, and if you're familiar with Rushdie's he has this essay about Midnight's Children. Yeah, and in some sense I'm fonder of this the 3-page essay than the Midnight Children, his the voluminous work, Midnight Children. So the essay, some of you might be familiar with it. It's called errata, or unreliable narration, in Midnight's Children. Then he talks about an instance, how he felt traumatized in the 1960s during the Indo-China War. And right after talking about it, he suddenly remembers, oh, come on, wait a minute. I was not in India at that point of time. So he's actually, he's been feeding onto this collective memory, and that trauma becomes his own trauma, though he was not anywhere in India or anywhere in China or not even anywhere in the borders at that time. Yeah. So that's a memory that has become his own memory, though it was not his experiential memory at all. And sometimes it will also happen that even when he had experienced certain things, imagine, you witnessed an accident, or, you were part of certain some certain natural calamity is happening, and you were right in the middle of it. And when you're trying to recollect and narrate it, sometimes you realize that not just your experience, but the experience that you heard about, or, the notion of a traumatic experience, that also feeds into your memory. And it does not mean that your memory is false, yeah? Because every time, you are narrating an incident, you find that you're giving a different version altogether. As students of literature, we were also taught that whenever you read a text again, it's never the same text. You're reading it in a very, very different way. You change the point of view a little bit, and you find that it's a very different story altogether. A classic case in point would be Jane Eyre and the post-colonial rewritten version by Jean Rhys, yeah, White Sargasso Sea. Yeah, you look at Jane Eyre and White Sargasso Sea. Yeah, so what is the one thing that has changed? Yeah, the villainous woman who was hidden in the attic, she has become, the storyteller. Yeah, the moment the mad woman in the attic becomes the storyteller, you see that you have a different story altogether, a different identity altogether. You look at characters in a very different way altogether. It's the same in a point of view. In fact, it's very, very interesting. It's very fundamental to most memory studies research too. It changes the version of history, the experience, everything changes depending on how you are looking at it, how you are accessing a certain incident. So what is the point of all this? Why am I bringing together all of these different notions together? This is something which I also believe that, has the power to radically change and influence the way in which we are conducting research in terms of either in terms of the way in which we read fiction, the way in which we read history, or maybe the way in which we are reading the everydayness, the everyday events. Yeah. So coming back to the everydayness, that the slow memory thing is something that we are really fascinated with at the moment. In terms of the research that we are doing. So we could also recently publish one of our papers in the Memory Studies Journal, the SAGE Journal of Memory Studies. There, we are looking at COVID-19 as a chronotop. Yeah, I'm sure some of you who've been researching on Bhakti would know this term, chronotop. We are looking at this COVID-19 as a chronotop, yeah, which changed our notions of pretty much everything. Particularly our notions of time, space, trust, and tactility. Yeah. So I repeat, our notions of time, space, trust, and tactility. Yeah. If I could quickly elaborate on that. Yeah. Our notion of time, in fact, the private time, the public time, yeah, online time, offline time, everything has changed radically. Yeah. Again, as a detour, let me draw your attention to a story that I hope most of us are familiar with. Yeah. Borges has this fascinating story, A Garden of Walking Paths. Yeah, Borges, the Argentinian short story writer. Yeah, in Garden of Walking Paths, he, in fact, that was seen as one of those works which inaugurated the postmodern moment in the Western world. Yeah, so in that story, he explores this possibility of a character inhabiting multiple spaces in multiple time zones. Yeah, that was seen as a thought which is very, very radical. But today, you and I, at this very moment, which is part of our everydayness, you and I, we find that we are actually inhabiting multiple time zones. We are actually, if you have, if you're attending an event which is say hosted from the other part of the planet, you would know that you too have the potential to inhabit multiple time zones and multiple physical spaces for sure. Even if, right now at this moment, I have at least two kinds of locations for sure. One is this virtual location where I'm interacting with you. The other one, the real physical space where, I'm rooted, the space where we are rooted with gravity, our real physical space. All of us at any given point of time during this meeting, at least, we are all inhabiting at least these two worlds. And in between this, if some of us choose to use this device, which has become an extension of our identity, we will find that, we have this endless possibilities of inhabiting different worlds, communicating with different people at different points of time. So it has radically changed our notion of time. And also we really don't have now, a notion of social time or private time, because even when you socialize, you can't trust people. Trust has changed, taken a very different a form altogether. You don't even trust another person to borrow a pen now, because that person could be a carrier, you could be a carrier. So trust has become something else altogether. You don't know when you can open up the doors of your home for socializing. Even weddings, which were really epic events in our country, we know, in terms of, the numbers, in terms of the rituals, a lot of things have been changing radically. And also, there was a time when particularly during the very peak pandemic time, when the lockdown was implemented in different parts of the country. There are certain kinds of daily rituals that you had to do before that. For instance, think about something very mundane as vegetable shopping. Go to a shop, you touch the vegetable, you feel the texture of the vegetable, and then you buy it, because touching and knowing how that feels, that also affected the quality of that object that you're buying, and sometimes the quality of what one cooks at home. So that became a luxury, because there was no option of doing that. And when things are getting delivered at home, when things are getting ordered, we do know that the kind of difficulties and how we had to really struggle to get used to this new mode. So in some form, this, when we look at this this ongoing pandemic, and we don't even know in what all different forms and shapes it will take. In various forms, we find that this itself has become a chronotop, and it has been changing the way we think about pretty much everything in and around us. And even the masked identity. Earlier, imagine walking into a space like a bank with a mask. You will be seen with a lot of suspicion. It had a different connotation altogether. A masked individual. Now a non-masked individual is seen as a threat. He's seen as a social threat. He or she is seen as an irresponsible person. So a lot of things have been changing, and this is also part of the slow memory. So I'm just giving some examples from the various things that we had been doing, and I really hope that at least some of you would get in touch, and we will explore different ways in which we can collaborate and see what forms of newer knowledge systems and knowledge models that we can bring up together. As a final note, some of the just leaving this open-ended in terms of interaction, we do have a couple of ongoing projects in terms of looking at the Anglo-Indian community, Anglo-Indian identity. Anglo-Indian, there is, we also, recently from the center, we published a book, an edited volume, which is looking at the transnational and interdisciplinary identity of the Anglo-Indian community, which is currently, based in India and in different parts of the world, the Indian diaspora in that sense. So as part of the research, our ongoing research, we look at national as well as diasporic memory, and we are trying to look at them in slightly different ways. And we do have, as in 2019, we hosted the first Memory Studies conference here at IIT Madras. 2019 was also the centenary year of Jallianwala Bagh, event. So what we tried to do as part of that was an experimental venture then, which has now become almost a solid form of a research for us now. So what we tried to look at that point was, to produce a mural artwork, which could be viewed through AR, augmented reality, an animated augmented reality app. So there is a mural artwork which reproduces the scene. I mean, it's not the exact replication of what happened, but a very abstract representation of the Jallianwala Bagh event. So when viewed through that app, an Android app, so this mural will become animated. So if this is something that is of interest, you could Google up and you would know more about augmented reality. Augmented reality, in fact, fundamentally, it's nothing but using technology to change the way in which the physical reality appears. And in a very not a very fundamental sense, in fact, as students of literature, as people who are reading and teaching fiction, that is something we have been trained to do as well. You look at the world through this prism of fiction. It's actually, what does fiction do? It just changes the physical reality in different forms, the physical world in different forms, and gives us alternate possibilities as well. So please do write to us if if your students are looking for internship opportunities, if you are looking for collaborative projects. If you have an interesting project idea, do write to us. We will see how best we can work together as it could be an individual collaboration, it could be a department-based collaboration. And we do maintain two websites. If you just Google up, you will find them: the Center for Memory Studies and the Indian Network for Memory Studies. So we try to keep it as updated as possible with the latest events. And as I mentioned, if your students are interested in internship possibilities, please encourage them to write to us, because we're also fundamentally looking at developing a pool of networks, a pool of like-minded researchers, with whom we really hope that this domain can become this discipline can take a very, very definite Indian shape in the years to come, in the decades to come. So thank you all for your time, and I really appreciate being a wonderful audience, and thank you, Rajana Pante, for the invitation. And I'm really happy to be a part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an enlightening talk. I'm quite sure that still the participants are just grappling with the kind of questions which this talk may have ignited. And yes, I was right, because yes, I have, I think, a couple of observations, especially in terms of appreciation. Thank you, ma'am, for taking such an interesting topic. It was indeed a kind of delight. And
Thank you,
there is one from Annie. Annie is one of our students in PZ, pursuing PZ. She's asking a question: ma'am, can you please suggest more books regarding this? And apart from, yes, ma'am, just let me complete, please.
Sure.
And apart from a wide Sargosa Sea by Jane Eyre, I mean, this is what I think she might have remembering. What are the other texts which can be useful in terms of the studies?
Certainly. So you could perhaps, take a look at, a White Sargasso Sea and Jane Eyre. I use those novels as an example because I thought, those would be familiar to most of us. So you could start reading with, Astrid Erll, Astrid, ERLL. Astrid Erll is A Memory in Culture. So if any of you, if you want to contact me for research material or anything, let me give you you can write to me. I do try and respond to all emails within a decent time. So Astrid Erll is someone who can you can start reading up with, and there is also Aleida Osman, and there are certain earlier theorists from Maurice Holbrook. Some of you might be familiar with him. He is the one who used the term cultural memory for the first time, and Pierre Nora, Pierre, and Nora, a French theorist, So these could be some of your starting points, for you to use. And if there are particular kinds of works that you would like to access from our center, feel free to write to us. I do see one question here from Vidya. This is very helpful. And in fact, when I wanted to talk about autobiographies, autobiographies, memoirs can be biased. So will it help in identity framing? In fact, if you think about certain alternate forms of history telling, if I could use, the example of say African American community, or from, again, example closer from home, Dalit writings, yeah, or into a very large extent, gender, yeah, the earliest forms of feminist writings, yeah. So autobiography default mode in order for expressing what is outside of conventional history telling, conventional history documenting, yeah. So biases, in fact, I mean, I have a very different take on bias. I do believe that all kinds of writings are inherently biased, and I think it's a healthy bias to have, because if all of us start writing histories and telling the same sort of experiences, I guess it would be a very, very boring life to live. Even with the pandemic, which has affected all of us in similar ways, we have a different take on that, different experience. So I do understand the question, in terms of identity framing and how bias could be sometimes very, very helpful, because we have seen such instances in global history too. But what I would advise is, I mean, just the way you would use your training to read text. I think, as students of literature, I believe that we are best equipped to read any kind of text, any kind of context. You read a newspaper article too, and I believe that, I'm obviously being very, very biased towards our own discipline. I believe that we have an additional edge to see the point of view and to just see, from which perspective the story is being told, and whether there are other perspectives too. Yeah. So while autobiographies and memoirs can be biased, of course, I agree with it, but that's a very, very interesting intervention. Historically, autobiographies and memoirs have been seen as interesting interventions, which could sort of splinter the consensus which is there in most dominant historiographies. Yeah. And these memoirs, autobiographies, individual stories, stories of communities are actually very, very important to in forms in identity formation, because we do know that we do know the pitfalls of a dominant historiography and the need to interpret it, to revisit it, to rewrite it from different perspectives. So though there are biases, there are problems, these are interesting interventions. And also I would say that the point is also the point is also not to say the center should keep changing, in terms of the center and the margins. Yeah, we would never arrive at a point where you can decide, okay, this is the absolute center, which will not have any bias, which will not have any hierarchy. Yeah, because fundamentally human brain, human systems, all the systems that we are part of, they're very deeply hierarchical, deeply biased. So perhaps the only way in which we can negotiate and navigate through is to make sure that the center keeps shifting. There are multiple newer interventions which would keep questioning this, like Rashomon effect. Yeah, you might be familiar with that movie. It's the same incident, the same murder. We don't even know whether the murder happened or not. 7 different versions. Yeah, you keep everyone is supposedly narrating the same thing, but many, many different versions. In fact, even from our own contemporary lived history, we can think of any number of events which have multiple versions depending on. Those versions are very important. Yeah, the key thing is not to zero in on one as an authentic, but keep it sufficiently open-ended. I would even go to the extent of saying that if we are thinking about our own life history, yeah, we might be presenting it in different ways to different people at different points of time. Yeah, which is why, even in terms of a CV, we have an academic CV, we have a non-academic CV, at the time of applying for jobs and all. I mean, I wouldn't want to digress a lot, but thank you for these interesting interventions. And I think, there was one more.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes.
This is Chitra. It's a pleasure listening to you from Bhutan, ma'am. I have been listening to your lectures in NPTEL and SWAYAM as well and benefited a lot. Thank you so much. I have posted a query here regarding the types of memory. You have talked about slow memory. There are also other types of memory, and what are they that could be connected with trauma studies?
Right, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for this question. This is something, perhaps I should have addressed right at the beginning. So there are forms of memory which some of you might already be familiar with, collective memory and cultural memory. So the way it stands now, much of the current work on memory studies, it operates around cultural memory and collective memory. But there are also, with this influx of technology, there are also newer forms like, communicative memory, for instance. Yeah, connective memory. Yeah. So communicative and connective memory, Andrew Hoskins, Andrew Hoskins has spoken extensively about the connective turn in memory studies. Yeah, just like the narrative turn in in historiography studies by Hayden Waite in the 1970s. Now there is a connective turn, yeah, because everything that we do is connected and documented in some form or the other. In fact, Hoskins makes this very interesting point that at the moment we are the most documented generation, yeah. I mean, at this point, when I'm in this meeting, it is documented, yeah. When we are sending an email, it is documented. We have left our footprints in such almost, non-erasable ways everywhere. Yeah, so there is this newer forms of newer terms which are emerging as well. But and in terms of trauma studies, there is by default, I think I do get where this question comes from too. There is by default an organic connection made between memory studies and trauma studies. But also trying to locate our own research over here. What we are also trying to do in very healthy and active ways is to move away from the trauma model, because what has happened is for the longest time, memory of only traumatic incidents. I'm not devaluating that at any point. Yeah. Only the memory of traumatic incidents and what has been seen as traumatic say documented in extensive ways. Yeah, it also so happened that certain forms of individual trauma then did not quite become, did not fit the bill to be part of the trauma studies, which is why, I deliberately not spoken much about trauma and memory. But of course, to answer your question very pointedly, again, collective memory and cultural memory are two of the very broad terms under which most forms of memory could be located. There are also, there are a lot of subcategories like intergenerational memory, for instance. Yeah, and so one of you have also written about the partition literature. If you think about partition literature, of course, it falls under memory studies. Yeah, but to again, connect these two questions together, or you could find that there are very direct ways in which intergenerational memory, operates in such forms of reenactment and encoding of memory, because it is sometimes, it's not just about what I suffered as an individual, you and I suffered as an individual, but it's an aftermath. It's a vestige of what had happened perhaps 100 years back or 50 years back, and that has an impact. And this the studies on Anglo-Indian community that I mentioned, there also we draw much from say intergenerational memory. And again, can branch this out into multiple forms of categories. For instance, nostalgia. Even nostalgia could be seen in two different ways. There is a say nostalgia could happen as in a retrospect sense. Think about what had happened. It could also have a very proactive quality. You are nostalgic about something, and in order to address that gap, you build something new. Yeah. So I think Aleida Osman and some Astrodol will give you a very good grounding on these different theoretical forms and different forms of memory as well. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Yeah.
We have one more query. Who gave the concept of memory studies? Rahul Kumar. Yes,
memory as a concept was always there. Yeah, as a concept, if you think, memory was always there. I would, there are a lot of other historians and theorists too who have spoken about it. If you think about the evolution of human history, yeah, there was always this desire to document. Why did people start writing? Just to keep it, to preserve it in memory. Yeah? And you think about the earliest time forms of manuscript, there was always this desire. They never thought that, let me just scribble it somewhere and throw it away. It always had to be preserved. Even before the technology of printing came into being. Yeah, we do know about, if the book history or the print history is something that is of interest to you, you would know that men and women had spent a number of a lifetime to preserve certain documents. Yeah, it is applicable to the philosophical texts, the religious texts, everything, and also a lot of human effort always went into copying the text and passing it on. Because that's the only way in which words could survive, thoughts could survive. Yeah, so fundamentally the need to preserve memory and this doubt that the human memory will not suffice, because very soon, if you look at the evolution of human culture, human civilization, human beings fundamentally did not always rely on their memory and the oral tradition. Yeah, they were very quick to explore. They were also anxious to explore different modes. And after printing, it has been a very, very different journey altogether. And with this digital onslaught, we've come to a point where it's almost impossible to destroy anything which has been documented in this space. It will be there in some form or the other. If you really want to dig it up, it is there, which is very, very unfortunate as well. Even if you don't want something to be there, it will keep showing up. So the point is, I think, memory is something which the human brain is hardwired to do. It was always there. If we are talking about memory studies as a domain, maybe my earliest bet would be Maurice Holbrook is one who started extensively theorizing memory, and most of the current historians and theorists of memory studies, they also, if you want the spelling, I could just write this. Maurice Holbrook. And yeah.
Yes, ma'am. We have Mr. Raj Nanduri.
Yes.
He is interested in knowing the references of memory studies in Upanishads and Vedic literature.
Yeah, I am not an expert to respond to this. Yeah, I think, any clue about Upanishads and Vedic literature. But I do, in one of our, workshops on memory studies, our head of the department did refer to how there are certain forms of, there's the notion of smriti, which has been much discussed. I am certainly not an expert in this area in Upanishads and Vedic literature, but I am sure there will be a lot, because even if you think about not just Upanishads and Vedic literature, from the stories from the epic, Shakuntalam, for instance, the entire story revolves around that momentary memory loss. So Shakuntala is forgotten by Dushyanta because he couldn't. There is a temporary memory loss. So memory is something which has been explored fictionally as well as philosophically in all traditions, because human brain is hardwired to remember. The moment you forget your memory, in fact, if you think about that one moment, even if it's just 5 seconds of memory loss, it can completely disorient you. So I would believe that this is certainly something some of you could perhaps explore in terms of how memory would get reflected. Memory is reflected in most of the ancient Indian texts as well.
Ma'am, we have a couple of more questions. We have one from Vartika Giri.
Yes.
She's asking, having different interpretations of memory and dealing with the various details from past and its relevance in present and future, does it create conflict? Or is this the basic idea to gather various interpretations which are valuable without question for documentation and research?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It's a very, very insightful intervention. Different interpretations of memory, different interpretations of experience were always there. In fact, if we think about the trajectory of history writing, many of the details from the past, they had to be reinterpreted, and some of the details, it has been useful for us to understand how systems and structures operated in the past. And sometimes, it also, of course, there is a conflict. There's always a fundamental conflict, not just between this ancient past and the present, even between what we a version of an event that we remembered yesterday and today, and in that fundamental sense, if you actually think about, there is certainly a conflict. You think about, I'm just giving a very, very crude and loose example again, think about a movie or a text that you engaged with when you were, say, 15 years old, and then compare it with, the way you would respond to it now, because it's also a reinterpretation, a very different interpretation of your memory as well as an experience. Sometimes, you feel that, how could I even respond that way? And now you remember an event in a very different way. So the conflict is there. The conflict is fundamental to these different versions of memory, not necessarily the versions remembered by different individuals and different communities, but of course, even within the same heterogeneous groups or within the same individual itself. And some of the classic cases, that in terms of history that one could point out is the colonial and the post-colonial memory. So there are certainly very, very different interpretations. You look at, 1857 revolt. There is a way in which the colonial history writers would remember it, and even within our post-colonial state, you at the angle of gender, at the angle of caste, religion, there are different interpretations of it. So that conflict, of course it creates conflict. I think it is in that, it's a positive conflict. It is in that from that conflict that perhaps newer forms of knowledge production, newer forms of acknowledgement of identity all could emerge. Yeah, so this is the basic idea, to gather various interpretations which are valuable without question for documentation and research. Yeah. Yeah, I think we are, again, since our brain is a biased machine, we are also tempted to question whatever we get. The question of authenticity, that can this be included or not? Yeah, that would be there. That anxiety, that pressure would be there all the time. But this is an ideal situation, and that what Vartika Giri has pointed out, to gather various interpretations and just document them and lay it out there. These different notions were also there. I think in the current stage, we are, in varying degrees in different parts of the world, this is being done. There's a version of, I mean, even for, say, if you take the case of, a figure like Gandhi, Nehru, yeah, you find that, all these figures who were seen as unquestionable at some point, they're all being questioned. There are multiple forms of interpretation, modes of interpretation now available. There are different sides of the story. Even look at the way media operates today. And there was a time when where I grew up during a time when Doordarshan was the only way in which one could get access to news. Newspaper was seen as, you would sit with it, you would be advised by teachers and parents to sit with the newspaper so that you can improve your general knowledge. Yeah, that was seen as that site where truth is given out, knowledge, information is given out. Now, we have a very different take on, that's also one of the ways in which this connection between history and memory, all these are changing, because now we know that there are multiple perspectives depending on their religious affiliation, political affiliation, their regional affiliation, all that is there. Yeah, so it is, in some sense, we are by default as a thinking community moving towards this gathering of various interpretation. Yeah, we would of course continue to question, but we wouldn't stop this process of interpretation and accumulating them in for further approach. Yeah. So thank you so much for these very engaging questions. And like I said, I'm happy to continue to engage with you over email. And I wouldn't want to, keep you long from lunch either. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, yes, already it's lunch time. So really, I mean, today, ma'am, you have opened new vistas and you have opened new trajectories where further researches could be laid out and could be, carried out in your future. And the way you laid down the foundations of memory studies in terms of its relationship with the history, memory, and identity, the new kind of historiography that is really remarkable. And you rightly talked about its interdisciplinarity, its transnational nature, and the kind of slow memory and the micro and macro. Then talking about the memories in terms of pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modern in terms of them, really you have done the job extremely well, and I am quite hopeful that all the participants must be taking back home something really that would be kind of gem. Thank you so much for this contribution and this enlightening
great
talk. Thank you.
opportunity. I really hope that in the not too distant future we will all get to meet in
Sure, ma'am. Sure. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pandey. It was an absolute delight.
May I request all the participants to please open their video so that, switch on your camera so that we can have a group photograph. Can you please? All the participants, please. Yes. Manjari, are you there?
Not the faculty members, Sura?
I mean, those who are in this video chat, they all are the participants. She is Professor Alka Singh, the dear principal, ma'am. We call her Didi. So,
About and
Good to see you all.
and I hope we do look forward to your visit to Kashi and Varanasi. So thank you. My video is also on. Okay.
yes, Manjari.
Yes, Bhaiya, I have taken the picture.
Thank you so much. But your video is off.
Actually, I'm having the camera in my hand. That is why my photo is off. I will send my separate photo. Okay. I have already taken. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for now.
Thank you all very much. Yeah, take care. Stay safe. Yeah, bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye, ma'am.